All right, so good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all here. My name is Caroline. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. And today I'm here to talk to you about social robots in the lives of children. So let's go ahead. I'll talk in English. I'll try to be slow such that the interpreters can keep up with me. If you have any questions later, just ask me. So let's start all the way at the beginning, right? What are social robots anyway? Well, broadly speaking, there's three kinds of social robots. First, we have mechanomorphic robots, and these are robots that basically resemble machines. And Cosmo here, all the way on the left, is a perfect example of this category. Cosmo resembles a little excavator, and you can basically play games with it using these blocks, which it can stack, etc. Then we have zoomorphic robots, which resemble animals. And Pleo, the little dinosaur robot, is a perfect example of this category. Pleo is a robot that you need to raise, you need to feed it, and you need to teach it how to do things. And that can really take some time and effort, as one of the professors in our department experienced. She took this robot home for a couple of weeks once to try to test it. And in the end, she just turned it off completely because it drove her crazy. She didn't have any alone time anymore because this robot would even follow her into the bathroom. And then the third category is anthropomorphic robots. These are robots that resemble machines, as you see, and these robots are often able to engage with you in a verbal interaction, in a conversation. So this is just to show you that there's a variety of robots that all look different. These robots also have different capacities, and therefore it's difficult to define what a social robot is based on how it looks or what it does. So, if not based on appearance or capacities, then when is a robot considered social? Well, according to Lee and colleagues, a robot can be called social if it is autonomous, if it's able to interact not only with people, but also with other robots and its environment, if it adheres to the norms that rule human behavior, if it is intelligent, if it automatically is able to detect people based on sensory recognition, and if it both expresses and understands human emotion. Well, that's quite some requirements to being social, right? However, to date, most social robots are still really quite limited, contrary to media depictions, I'd say. And to demonstrate this to you, I brought little clips from our own robot in our lab. So let's have a look.
I can't connect to the network. I can't connect to the network.
So it's unable to connect to the internet network. Other problems?
Hello, I am going to stand up.
So it said I'm going to stand up, not going to happen. And not only standing up, but also remaining on its feet is a little difficult still. Yeah, quite sad. But it's able to get out now though, so that's good. But yeah, you'll agree with me, I think, that if this is difficult for current social robots, then these expectations are a little bit too high, really, still. So what if social is then not determined on the technological capacities of a robot, but rather based on the user's response to it? That's what Amy van Wijnsbergen proposed when she defined social robots as robots that are perceived to be social. So here the focus is not on the technological specifications of the robot, but rather on the perception of the users interacting with this robot. Well, this is certainly a more realistic definition to use. However, Kay Darling and colleagues investigated how people respond to a Roomba robot, which you see here on the screen. So this is basically a robotic vacuum cleaner without any social skills whatsoever. And in her study, she still saw that people name this robot, they talk to it extensively, and they feel bad for it when it, for instance, gets stuck under a couch. Exactly, yes, exactly. So we do this all the time in our lives, correctly. But so if sociality is in the eye of the beholder, right, then basically any robot or any object, a car, could be termed social. So what I'm speaking of when I speak of social robots are robots that are primarily made for interactions with people, basically. So I understand social robots to be robots whose primary purpose is to speak with people or to interact with people, rather than, for instance, do chores or work in a factory. So this definition also clearly distinguishes between, on the one hand, social robots and on the other hand, functional robots. But we're here today to talk about children, so let's do so. Children will, in the near future, increasingly encounter social robots in their daily lives. And we know that children tend to think of such robots as potential friends. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First, children have strong anthropomorphic tendencies, which basically means that they see human everywhere in their surroundings. Adults do this too, as we just saw from the Roomba research, but children have a much stronger tendency to do this. So they basically interpret their surroundings in human-like terms, and therefore also relate to social robots as if they're relating to a peer, to a human. Second, children find it hard to distinguish between what is real and what is not, at least until the age of 8 to 9 years old. This is, for instance, demonstrated by the fact that in this age range, children start to understand that Santa Claus is not real, but when they encounter Santa Claus in a shopping mall, they will still be very excited and nervous for that. And this is because they are still not very able to distinguish between their fantasy on the one hand and reality on the other. Third, and not unimportantly, adults also present social robots to children as potential friends. And so it's little surprising that children then interpret them as such, right? Now, the question is whether it's a good or a bad thing that children have this social response to robots. And some scholars argue that it's a good thing, even stating sometimes that to promote the welfare of children effectively, some degree of bonding between the robot and child will have to occur. And indeed, it seems that the emergence of social relationships between children and robots can be beneficial to the use of robots in societies. So, for instance, scholars have investigated whether we can use social robots in hospitals to accompany children who have cancer during their treatment, and more specifically when they have to undergo radiation therapy. So, during this specific treatment, parents are not able to stay with children in the room, but a robot is able to do so. And when children consider this robot that accompanies them a friend, it can offer them more effective social support during this treatment. Another setting in which it may be beneficial for children to see robots as friends is education, because there are some studies that suggest that if children feel a kind of friendship to a robot, they learn more effectively from this robot too. But let's also have a look at the other side of the coin, because there's also scholars that are quite concerned actually about this tendency that children have to see robots as friends. For instance, Sherry Turkle, who argues that social robots are seductive and offer the wrong payoff, the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship, and the illusion of connection without the reciprocity of a mutual relationship. Scholars have, for instance, argued that child-robot relationship formation may have negative consequences for the child when a robot breaks down or when it's taken away from a child. So, for instance, imagine that a child has ended their hospital stay, so they go home, and they have undergone this treatment together with a robotic friend. Then at the end, when they leave the hospital, they also have to leave their robots behind. And these robots in such applications are often programmed to really encourage children to think of them as human-like peers. So they, for instance, pretend to have a personality and to actually care for the child. Now, you can imagine that due to this, for children, it really feels like they then have to leave a friend behind. So they suddenly just do not see this friend anymore, which can be quite distressing. Also, imagine that a child is undergoing treatment, and in the middle of this treatment, their robotic friend breaks, and they have to suddenly go through the rest of it alone. That can be quite emotional to them. Also, some scholars have warned that under some circumstances, some children may start to prefer playing with robots over playing with peers. This picture is from a research that is currently going on in the Netherlands, where they're investigating the use of social robots in primary schools. And these robots are used as a confidant for bullied children. So what happens then if a bullied child can confide in this robot, but at a certain point starts preferring to play with this robot in break time rather than play with their peers? That could harm their development of social skills and further deteriorate their social situation. Also, most people would agree that if a child tells to a robot about a bullying experience, their teacher should know about this in order to be able to step up and do something about the bullying. But what if a child tells about a bullying experience to a robot in private and expects their robot friends to keep this a secret? Then when the teacher suddenly knows that the child told this to the robot, the child can actually feel kind of betrayed, which may cause emotional harm as well. Also, if robots need to store information that children tell them during such conversations, this of course raises privacy issues and the risk of this information being used for the wrong purposes and by the wrong people. And finally, scholars have voiced the concern that children will develop master-servant relationships with robots. That is to say, children tend to see robots as friends, but at the same time, they can tell these robots what to do, right? They are kind of the boss in this relationship. And so the worry is that at a certain point, if children in the future get used to these robotic relationships, they may start to display this behavior in peer friendships as well. So they may get less used to situations in which they have to negotiate about decisions, and therefore their bossy behavior toward robots may spill over to their relationships with peers. Now, of course, one could wonder whether we should really be so worried, right? Because there's always worries every time a new technology is introduced into children's lives. We are worried what it may do to them. For instance, when the Tamagotchi first came on the market, people were really worried that this would ruin children's sense of consequence, because the Tamagotchi can be reset. Every time it dies, you can press the reset button and it comes to life again. And there were great worries that this would ruin children's sense of the severity of these consequences in real life. Also, the same with the Furby, which is often considered the first prototype of a social robot. People were really concerned what happens when children get attached to these Furbies and then the Furby breaks. Now, the current situation, the current generation who grew up with these technologies seems to be fine, and I can speak from personal experience in that sense. I had a Tamagotchi and I'm fine. So we could say, should we really be so worried about robots, right? Is that really necessary? Well, we're not sure yet, but at least there's two important differences between social robots and these technologies. First, robots are able to engage children in verbal interactions, and therefore the interactions that children have with these robots, as well as the relationship they develop with them, are much more similar to peer friendships, and therefore can have a different influence on children. And second, robots can actively encourage the emergence of a child-robot relationship through conversations, among others. And therefore, as opposed to these attachments that children form with, for instance, their Furby, child-robot relationships are not only based on the child's fantasy, but also on robot influence. Now, luckily, all is not lost, because one thing that may help to decrease potential downsides of child-robot interaction is transparency, which is what Boden and colleagues already in 2017 argued in their Principles for Responsible Robotics, in which they, among others, state that robots are manufactured artifacts and their machine nature should be transparent to their user. Because when we're being transparent, people will be better able to understand what a social robot is, what it is not, what it is capable of, and what it cannot do. And therefore, this will lead to more realistic expectations from the beginning, which may in turn decrease the risks that we just discussed. Calls for transparency can also be found in, for instance, the Montreal Declaration of Responsible AI, as well as in the European Commission's AI Act. However, initial studies seem to suggest that transparency is ineffective in changing children's responses to social robots. For instance, Turkel and colleagues reported that even when they explained to children the mechanic nature of a robot, and each child was allowed to turn off the robot and control it themselves, then still children continued to think of this robot as a living and human-like being, so they were unable to demystify the machine to the children. In addition, if children see robots as friends, or they need to see robots as friends in order for robot applications in society to be successful, then one could wonder whether a transparent, responsible approach to social robots does not stand in the way of the effective use of robots in society. Given that existing research on the topic was really quite scarce still and had a lot of limitations, we didn't know yet. And that is why me and my colleagues decided to further investigate the question whether and how transparency about social robots influences how children respond and relate to such robots. Therefore, we conducted 3 experimental studies in which children aged 7 to 10 years old interacted with a Now robot. Either at school, at a museum, they had a short conversation with this robot. And in each of these studies, half of the children was provided with transparent information about the robot, whereas the other half of the children received neutral, robot-unrelated information. After their interaction, then, they'd fill out a questionnaire, and this way we could measure whether children who had received transparent information thought of the robot differently than children who had not received this information. So, in the first experiment, I sat next to children during their interaction with this Now robot, and I provided them with either transparent information or neutral information. And you can see an example of this information here on the screen. So, to half of the children, I said that the story that Now had told them was put into Now's computer because robots can only say what is in their computer, thereby being transparent about the robot's mechanic nature and its lack of human capacities. Whereas in the other condition, I only told children something unrelated to the robot, so something neutral. So here I talked about fairy tales and the creatures that pop up in those. So transparent versus neutral. In the second experiment, the same neutral or transparent information was offered to the children, but this time I didn't tell them, but the robot told them about itself. So this time, during the conversation, the robot itself would explain to half of the children that it was a machine with limited technological capacities. And since the information being provided in this study was exactly the same as the information provided in the previous study, this study had the aim to see whether robots can also be effectively transparent about themselves. Now, as said before, robots that exist today are often still quite limited, and therefore they cannot yet reliably and autonomously interact with children by themselves, which is why often these robots are manually controlled by a human during their interaction with children. And in this third study, I wanted to see whether children would respond differently to the robot and think about it differently when they knew about this upfront. So here, to half of the children, I received the manually controlled nature of the robot upfront by telling them that during their interaction with the robot, I would control it from a distance, from a laptop. I also told them that Now couldn't talk to them by itself, that I had to press a button every time to make the robot say something, and that I had to start up a computer program before they could ask the first question to the robot, because in that computer program, I wrote the responses that Now would give. So, complete demystification. So what did we find? Well, in all of these studies, we saw that children who had received the transparent information about the robots had more realistic robot perceptions than children who had received the neutral information, who were in the other group. These children, for instance, thought of the robot less as a living being. They perceived it to be less human-like, and they also thought that it was less similar to themselves. In addition, we found that children who had received the transparent information were more critical toward the robot's friendship potential. That is, they felt less closeness toward the robot and also trusted it a little bit less than children in the neutral group. At the same time, neither closeness nor trust disappeared completely. So transparency did not stand completely in the way from children's perception of the robot as a potential friend, but it did make them a little bit more critical toward this robot. So there's 2 main messages that I'd like for you to take home from all of this. The first of which is that responsible robotics allow children to take a more critical stance toward social robots. And the second one is that this more critical stance toward robots does not have to stand in the way of the effective implementation of social robots in society aimed at increasing children's welfare. Thank you very much.
Caroline, thank you very much for your speech. Czy mają Państwo jakieś pytania? Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Super interesting, especially like from this perspective. And my question is to you, whether you research also the role of parents in providing social robots to children, and whether they are aware of all the principles, how social robots work, how the information is proceeded in terms of privacy, data protection of the kids, because it's sensitive data, and if they collect something, so like, what the role of parents in this process? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. In my work, I do not research parents' involvement in this, but a colleague of mine who works with the Cosmo robot that we saw all the way in the beginning, she does in-home research. So she basically bought 500 of these robots and distributed them to families across the Netherlands. And she basically, for a couple of months, observed how children and parents interacted with this robot. And one of the findings from that study was that parents' stance towards the technology is very important in children's adoption of a social robot and how they basically see it. So we see that parents have a major role to play here. At the same time, we also see that robot literacy, so parents' robot knowledge, is really still lacking a little bit. So here there's really also indeed a challenge of not only informing children, but informing their parents alongside with that to enable conversations at home about this new technology and the role it may play. Yeah, very good point.
I have another question. Do you have information about, is that a growing trend in terms of marketing? Are there more and more robots for children? Is it a future that we should expect in a few years, like to have robots in, I don't know, every second home?
Well, I think it's not going as fast as the media tries to make us believe. I mean, there's more and more robots on the market, but there's also a lot of robot companies going bankrupt, and mainly because I think expectations of robots are currently way too high. So when we buy a robot or when we use it, we have sky-high expectations of what this can do for us or our child, and often this is really not the case. As you saw in the videos, robots are really still quite limited. Which is also why at this point they are used in society, but mostly in public settings, for instance, hospitals, schools, where they can be manually controlled by researchers or by therapists, for instance, and not so much yet in children's homes, I think. I think it will be the future. There will be more robots, but it will go much slower than anticipated. Thank you. Thanks.